No one ever imagined that a slight crackle of burning timber could conceal such a critical secret, but Chuck Norris sensed something deeper the moment he stood near those flames. The fire department had cordoned off the vicinity around a 3-story apartment building in an older part of Denver because neighbors had reported smoke curling from the windows. Several firefighters were methodically checking each floor and assuring the onlookers that everything was under control, but Chuck narrowed his eyes at the sight of the scorched walls and the low-hanging haze that seemed to swirl with ominous intent. He could smell a strange urgency in the air. People knew Chuck was volunteering to coordinate relief efforts, so many moved aside to give him room. They appreciated his presence because the area was tense, filled with swirling ash and anxious murmurs from families who had been evacuated. This was supposed to be a simple situation, a contained blaze that had died down enough for the professionals to finalize their checks. They had come out of the building announcing that nobody was inside, and they were about to finish their last sweep. Chuck inclined his head, listening to distant sirens and the overlapping conversations of concerned neighbors. But he also listened for something else. The commander in charge was confident that the building had been cleared, so he thanked Chuck for coming and mentioned that everything was nearly resolved. Chuck nodded with a polite grin, but he lingered and kept scanning the smoke as though waiting for an unspoken signal. There were times in his life when a subtle whisper of danger made him halt in his tracks. He had felt that in the mountains of Colorado when tracking a lost hiker, but he had learned that ignoring such a sense was foolish. Therefore, he did not move away from the scorched entrance. The heat still radiated from smoldering beams inside the structure, and small flames flickered in corners that the firefighters had yet to fully extinguish. Through the swirling gray haze, Chuck noticed that the second floor looked partially collapsed, which matched the firefighters' reports that certain areas were unstable. The onlookers remained behind the safety barricade, but Chuck kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as though he expected something else to happen. People knew better than to question Chuck Norris's instincts because he had proven time and again that his intuition was rarely wrong, so they stood there and waited. The commander sent a few men back inside to confirm that nobody had overlooked anything, and Chuck watched them disappear into the shadows. They called out that nothing remained, so the group inside prepared to exit. Chuck was about to nod in acceptance, but then he heard it. It was faint, a fragile echo of distress that most people would have missed under the crackling of timber and the hiss of sprayed water. Chuck narrowed his gaze at the second-floor windows because something told him the sound was coming from above the ground floor. He tilted his head to filter out the noise of the environment, and there it was again. A whimper, a soft and desperate cry that could only come from a small creature trapped in fear. He knew that even the best firefighters might not hear such a slight sound amid the chaos, but his senses had never betrayed him. He alerted the commander, insisting he had heard something alive on the second floor. The commander hesitated, explaining that every room had been checked. Chuck stood firm and said he was certain. The firefighters exchanged glances because they trusted Chuck's reputation for reading the environment better than most. The commander decided to check a little more thoroughly, so 2 firefighters ventured back to the second floor. Chuck paced outside and focused on the muffled sounds that reached him. He heard the men call out to see if anyone or anything would respond, but the crackling fire and the structural creaks of the building masked that faint whimper. They came back to the entrance shaking their heads, saying it was all clear. Chuck felt that spark of alarm ignite in his chest because he was sure the whimper was real. He realized that he would have to trust his gut. In a move that caught everyone by surprise, he took a large step forward. The commander tried to stop him, warning that a section of the building had become dangerously compromised and could collapse at any moment. The floor might give in under too much weight, and the hot spot still smoldering could create a flashover. Chuck nodded at the warnings but refused to back down. He said that a living being was inside, and he was not leaving it behind. A firefighter attempted to hand Chuck a spare mask, but Chuck simply pushed aside his doubts and said, "I'll be careful." He then strode past the smoky threshold. The crowd outside watched with a mixture of awe and tension because they knew Chuck was bold, but they also knew the building was on the verge of a possible collapse. Inside, the hallway was thick with swirling gray smoke that clung to the walls and the debris. Chuck squinted to protect his eyes. His boots crunched over fallen plaster and shattered glass, but he kept his hearing attuned to that faint whimper. The heat pressed against his skin as he moved deeper into the corridor. He tried to keep his breathing steady. He had faced adversity many times, but a burning building was an unpredictable beast. He walked slowly, testing each footstep because the floor might be weakened by the flames. Broken furniture lined the walls, and scorched wallpaper hung in tattered strips. He heard the faint hiss of water dripping from a half-broken sprinkler overhead. The overall scene was dimly lit by the flickering glow of leftover flames licking at corners and door frames. Smoke choked the air, forcing Chuck to cover his mouth with his arm, but he pressed on because that frightened whimper called him forward. He arrived at a stairwell that led to the second floor. The firefighters had deemed it mostly impassable, but Chuck found a narrow path where the steps weren't completely destroyed. He tested his weight on each step, feeling them groan. Outside, the bystanders held their breath while the commander considered sending in a rescue team after Chuck. Yet the structure was too unstable, and nobody wanted to risk more lives. They stood in pensive silence, hoping Chuck's skill would guide him to safety. Chuck advanced up the stairs, pushing aside bits of smoldering debris that threatened to block his path. The smoke thickened on the second floor, stinging his eyes. He coughed softly but kept going. He realized that the sound must be coming from one of the rooms on the left side because that was where the smoke was thickest, which implied more hidden heat. He took a moment to listen, heart pounding in his chest. There it was again, that small whimper. It sounded terrified. Chuck forced his way down the corridor until he found a door with burnt edges. The handle was warm to the touch, and the wood crackled under his fingertips. He pressed his ear to the door and heard a faint scratching sound followed by that sorrowful whine. His heart clenched because he pictured a helpless creature locked in there. Without hesitation, he forced the door open with a powerful kick. Smoke billowed out into the hallway, and he shielded his face. The interior was even darker, a swirling mass of heat and shadows. He stepped inside. The whimper intensified, echoing against the walls. He called out softly, reassuring the trapped creature that he was there to help. His words were lost in the roar of distant flames, but he wanted to convey comfort. He searched under overturned furniture. He squinted around the room, ignoring the surge of heat creeping in from a crack in the ceiling. It took a moment for him to find a battered table that had collapsed against a corner. In the shadow beneath it, he glimpsed a pair of frightened eyes that reflected what little light the flames provided. A dog crouched behind the table, paws trembling and muzzle streaked with soot. It looked like a medium-sized mongrel with scruffy fur, but its gaze locked onto Chuck with a mixture of terror and longing for help. Chuck spoke soothingly, inching closer until the dog allowed him to reach out. The poor animal shivered uncontrollably. Chuck carefully coaxed it out from behind the debris, gently lifting it into his arms. The dog let out a small whimper, as though it couldn't believe someone had come to rescue it. Chuck looked around and realized they had to move fast because he could feel the building groaning. The ceiling above them made a foreboding crack. Dust rained down, and the temperature rose. He knew they had only a short time before the structure might come down. He rushed toward the door, dog held firmly against his side, covering its snout lightly to help reduce the smoke intake. The hallway felt hotter than before. Flames flickered through cracks in the walls. He moved as quickly as he dared, carefully testing each step to avoid any sudden breaks. Outside, the crowd grew uneasy. They could see from the angle of the windows that the second floor was no longer stable. A giant chunk of the roof had started to sag, and the firefighters yelled at everyone to back away from the perimeter. The commander's eyes were fixed on that entrance, silently praying to see Chuck reappear. Debris rained down from the second floor, sending smoke swirling in chaotic patterns. The tension built. That was when Chuck emerged onto the landing of the stairwell. Through the haze, he saw that the path he had taken was now partially blocked by burning debris. The dog's ears pinned back in fear. Chuck held it closer and assessed the situation. He realized that clearing the debris with brute force might risk a backdraft or partial collapse, but he also knew they had no choice. Carefully, he kicked aside a loose beam, then shoved a half-burned piece of drywall. Flames licked at his boots, but he refused to stop. Suddenly a loud crack echoed overhead. Chuck glanced up and saw a jagged crevice racing across the ceiling, threatening to split it wide open. He clenched his jaw and pressed forward. The dog whimpered again, burying its muzzle against his chest. He forced a path through the rubble. With each step, the building groaned louder. He could feel the entire structure trembling, like a wounded beast about to give up. Outside, the crowd gasped in horror as part of the roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. The commander ordered everyone to stand clear, but eyes remained glued to that doorway, desperately hoping to see Chuck burst through. Thick smoke poured from the shattered windows, making it impossible to see inside from the street. The intensity of the situation felt suffocating. People whispered prayers. Children clung to their parents. Some bystanders began yelling Chuck's name, as if their voices might guide him out of the inferno. Inside, Chuck felt the tremor ripple through the floor. He realized this was happening faster than he had anticipated. The structural beams were giving way. He needed one final push to reach the exit. Flames flared up behind him, chasing him down the corridor. He clung to the dog, shielding its head from flying embers. The overhead lights flickered before shorting out, plunging the hall into near-total darkness save for the red glow of flames. Chuck pressed forward. He leaped over a fallen door that lay in his path. The dog let out another whimper, but Chuck maintained his calm. He could see faint light from the entrance, just enough to guide him. He was only a few steps away when the entire second floor gave a deafening groan. The ceiling behind him collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a cloud of sparks roaring upward. The impact threw Chuck forward. He stumbled but managed to twist his body so he wouldn't land on the dog. He hit the floor and rolled, clutching the animal tightly. Smoke and dust exploded around them, making it nearly impossible to see. Chuck's ears rang from the sound of the collapse, but he forced himself upright, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. He staggered to his feet. The dog looked at him with terrified eyes, but Chuck's presence seemed to provide a sliver of comfort. He dashed through the last few feet of hallway. At the threshold, a tongue of flame shot across his path, but he kicked aside a broken board and ducked around a partially collapsed beam. He finally emerged at the building's entrance. The cool rush of outside air felt jarring against his sweat-soaked skin, and he coughed as he inhaled a cleaner breath. A collective roar of relief and astonishment erupted from the crowd. Flashing lights from fire trucks illuminated Chuck's silhouette as he stepped onto the pavement, cradling the dog. Soot stained his clothes, and his arms bore small burns, but he appeared steady, unbowed by the ordeal. The dog looked around with wide eyes, trembling in his grip. The firefighters rushed over, dousing the entrance with more water to prevent further spread of flames, but the building was now clearly beyond salvage. Paramedics offered Chuck an oxygen mask, but he handed it first to the dog, ensuring that the wheezing creature got some clear air. It looked up at him with gratitude in its gaze. The onlookers marveled at this scene. The commander patted Chuck on the back, calling him a real hero for saving that helpless animal. Media crews that had been filming the firefighting effort surged forward, capturing the moment. Chuck didn't bask in the attention. He simply knelt down to let the dog rest on the ground. A veterinarian who had been assisting displaced pets hurried over to check the dog's condition. It appeared shaken but not severely injured. The veterinarian said the dog had likely inhaled a lot of smoke, so they'd give it immediate medical attention. Chuck gently ran his fingers through the dog's fur, speaking softly to calm it before handing it over to the specialist. People surrounded Chuck, wanting to congratulate him or shake his hand, but he stepped back to allow the emergency teams to do their work. He stood at a distance, watching the firefighter hoses continue their assault on the raging fire. Within minutes, the second floor collapsed entirely, sending a plume of smoke and sparks into the night sky. The crowd gasped in unison, realizing that if Chuck had been moments later, he and that dog might have been trapped. Tension gave way to relief, and a few onlookers began to applaud. Chuck nodded politely, though he seemed more focused on the well-being of the dog. He moved over to the command center, where the commander insisted that Chuck get checked out by paramedics for possible smoke inhalation. Chuck agreed with a polite smile but maintained that the dog was the priority. News reporters began to gather, cameras whirring, capturing the chaos of the scene. One journalist eagerly asked Chuck why he charged back in when the firefighters had already cleared the building. Chuck paused, letting the question linger in the smoky air. He said that sometimes the official checks don't catch every detail, especially when fear is silent and hidden. The reporter pressed him for more, but Chuck simply said the whimper called to him, and he was not about to leave someone, or something, behind if he could do something about it. That simple statement resonated with everyone nearby. The veterinarian approached to give Chuck an update on the dog. It was dehydrated and sooty, but stable enough to recover. The vet was prepared to house it at a local animal clinic for thorough treatment. Chuck gently patted the dog's head one more time, feeling an unspoken bond with the creature that had nearly been lost. The local community recognized Chuck's actions with deep gratitude. Families who had been displaced by the fire thanked him for stepping in, not just to help them but to save every life possible. The Red Cross volunteers who had set up a relief station offered Chuck water and a chance to clean up. He politely accepted their kindness, quietly grateful that the firefighters had managed to contain the worst of the blaze so that it wouldn't spread to neighboring buildings. Within an hour, the chaos began to subside. The building continued to smolder, but the main flames were under control. Some bystanders lingered, sharing the dramatic story of Chuck's rescue, while journalists tried to piece together their coverage. Paramedics gently checked Chuck's vitals, concluding that he was exhausted and had minor burns but was otherwise fine. He insisted that he felt good enough to remain with the relief efforts until everything was secured. Firefighters placed caution tape around the unstable parts of the structure, preparing to let the rest burn out in a controlled manner. Chuck slipped away from the spotlight to help families gather their valuables from a safe distance. Many of them had escaped in a hurry, leaving behind crucial items. Chuck offered calm words and warm reassurance. He told them that as long as they were safe, things could be replaced. People found comfort in his voice. Some recognized that behind the legend of Chuck Norris was a genuine heart that cared about every living being, big or small. Hours passed. The adrenaline of the night settled into weary relief. The once raging blaze dwindled to glowing embers under the watchful eye of the firefighters. The dog was taken to the animal clinic, and the vet reported that it was already showing signs of improvement. Word spread quickly that Chuck had rescued an animal that everyone else missed, and many praised his extraordinary senses. A radio station host who was broadcasting updates live from the scene claimed Chuck had hearing sharper than a canine, drawing laughs and nods of agreement. Chuck, meanwhile, maintained his modest stance. He simply said that luck played a role, but he always paid attention to every detail. The local authorities spoke about potential structural code violations in the burned building. Chuck, however, remained focused on ensuring displaced residents knew where to find assistance for temporary shelter. He coordinated with a local nonprofit to set up an emergency fund for families who had lost their homes. Reporters tried to catch him for an extended interview, but he politely declined, stating that the real heroes were the firefighters and volunteers who had worked tirelessly all night. Nevertheless, the crowd insisted Chuck deserved credit for his willingness to listen to that faint cry in a situation where many others might have dismissed it as random noise. The morning sun crept over the horizon, illuminating the charred remains of the building and the tired faces of everyone involved. Chuck noticed the veterinarian's vehicle parked nearby, and he walked over to see the dog. The vet smiled, explaining that the dog was recovering well, still shaken but breathing more easily. She asked Chuck if he might consider adopting it. He glanced at the creature through the window. It looked back at him with a calm, grateful expression. Chuck said he would consider it because he felt a tug at his heart. He always believed that fate brought people, and animals, together when they needed each other most. One local official mentioned organizing a ceremony to honor Chuck's bravery. Chuck shook his head, saying he appreciated the gesture but didn't need formal acknowledgments. He placed his focus on ensuring that the local shelter would be stocked with supplies for any pets left homeless by the event. Stories circulated of how Chuck had shown up that evening, initially just to lend a hand, only to defy the odds by plunging into a blazing building. Some community members joked that the fire never stood a chance once Chuck arrived, but others spoke in hushed tones of the moment they saw him emerge from the haze with that trembling dog in his arms. They described it as a scene out of a legend, except it was real. The dog, which the vet temporarily nicknamed Smokey, was given fluids, a thorough bath, and a comfortable place to rest. Chuck returned later that day to check on Smokey and stroked its head while it slept. The bond was already evident, and the veterinarian beamed with approval. Townspeople began wondering how many times Chuck had quietly stepped into dangerous situations to rescue someone in need. Some had heard rumors of his countless heroic deeds, but seeing it firsthand changed their perception forever. That night, with the building mostly reduced to a charred husk and the firefighters finishing up, Chuck joined the relief station for a final walkthrough. Families who had found alternative housing or were put up in local hotels thanked him again. He simply stated that he was grateful everyone made it out alive, including one small dog that almost didn't. Later, as the smoke from the dying embers drifted away and dawn approached again, Chuck silently walked the perimeter of the site, reflecting on how close that dog had come to perishing in the flames. He thought about all the times that small signals were overlooked. He believed that part of being who he was meant paying attention when others dismissed the faintest cry for help. In the days that followed, news outlets circulated the story of how Chuck Norris had once again proven that no challenge was too daunting. Footage showed him stepping out of the rubble, dusty and scorched yet triumphant, carrying a wide-eyed dog. The images spread across social media, touching the hearts of animal lovers everywhere. Donations poured in for the local fire department and for the Animal Rescue Center. Chuck attributed the attention to the dog's survival rather than his own actions. He said that spotlighting animal welfare was a cause worth celebrating. Weeks passed, and the building's remains were fully demolished for safety reasons. A small memorial was placed on the spot, honoring the families who had lost their homes. People still talked about Chuck's uncanny ability to pick up that faint whimper, calling it superhuman. Chuck visited Smokey regularly at the clinic until the day came when the vet declared the dog fit enough to leave. Chuck decided to adopt Smokey, providing a new home and a new life for the resilient canine. Residents cheered at the sight of Chuck walking through the neighborhood with Smokey trotting loyally beside him. The dog's tail wagged happily, a far cry from the terrified creature cowering behind a collapsed table. Although the ordeal left emotional scars on some of the families, they found solace in Chuck's selfless act. Many realized that a single moment of compassion could alter outcomes in ways no one expected. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "A Whimper Heard by a Hero," featuring pictures of Chuck and Smokey and detailing how a quiet night turned into a near disaster that ended with a rescue. Still, Chuck remained humble. He preferred focusing on the fact that everyone survived, and he volunteered to raise awareness about fire safety measures for pets and humans alike. Parents used the tale as a teaching tool for their children, explaining the importance of courage and compassion. Smokey gradually overcame the trauma and bonded more closely with Chuck. Some said that if Chuck was a legendary protector of people, he had now also become a guardian of animals. Others joked that the next time a building caught fire, it should simply give up because Chuck Norris would be on the way. In the privacy of his home, Chuck would watch Smokey sleep peacefully. He thought about that faint cry for help echoing through the darkness. He remembered pushing past the scorching flames and unstable floors because he refused to let fear decide the dog's fate. That conviction carried him through the building and out the other side. The next time he met the fire chief, the man clasped Chuck's hand with gratitude. Chuck gave him a calm nod and asked if the department needed any additional support for equipment or training. The chief laughed and said he appreciated the offer but that maybe he should just hire Chuck full-time. Chuck grinned and said he would stick to volunteer work. People still told stories of how Chuck stepped through that smoky doorway like he owned the place. Some added playful exaggerations about his footprints extinguishing the flames, but the core truth remained the same. He had heard a desperate creature's call and chosen to act when everyone else believed there was no need. He had done it without hesitation, without seeking applause, and he had emerged as a hero not just to the families but to a frightened dog that discovered a second chance in life. This story spread beyond Denver, capturing national headlines, and soon even more people recognized that Chuck's legendary reputation was well earned. Some said he had superhuman hearing, others claimed it was just a result of intense awareness. Chuck chuckled whenever he heard these claims. He simply believed in not ignoring the small voices of distress in a chaotic world. He knew that each act of compassion sent out ripples far greater than one might guess. People who had once been strangers now came together, forming a closer community ready to help whenever tragedy struck. Smokey's survival became a beacon of hope, proving that even when everything seems lost in the flames, there could be a chance if someone chose to answer the faintest whimper. Chuck carried those lessons in his heart, a constant reminder that heroism wasn't about grand gestures but about being present and willing to step into the fire if that was what it took to save a life. He and Smokey grew inseparable. They would stroll through the neighborhood, stopping to greet neighbors, some of whom whispered stories about the fire to visiting relatives, pointing at Chuck. Occasionally, an onlooker would approach and ask if Chuck had truly rushed back into a burning building just for a dog. Chuck would respond that there was no such thing as just a dog. He believed every life mattered. That notion resonated with people, shifting the perspective of those who thought heroism was reserved only for certain circumstances. Eventually, the place where the building once stood was cleared for a new project. Developers included a small park area, dedicating a portion of it in tribute to the firefighters and families who persevered. A plaque mentioned the dog rescue as a symbol of hope. Chuck sometimes passed by, reflecting on that night's events. Smokey would sniff around the green grass, happy and healthy. Children played nearby, and parents taught them about how one man listened to a sound nobody else heard and changed the course of that night. Chuck understood that life kept moving forward, always presenting new challenges. He remained ready, ever watchful, knowing that sometimes destiny spoke in whispers. The day after the dedication, Chuck sat on a bench with Smokey at his feet. A resident approached to share her gratitude for how his actions reminded everyone that no one and nothing should be left behind. Chuck thanked her kindly, though he downplayed his role. Smokey wagged his tail, as if to say he understood exactly how much Chuck had done. The sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. Chuck rose to leave, giving Smokey a pat on the head. In the fading light, the small plaque gleamed with silent testimony to that night's bravery. Chuck Norris walked away, prepared for whatever new challenge might come. He had learned that whether it was a dog trapped in a burning building or a stranger in need, heroism was a matter of unwavering resolve and an open heart. That was how his legend continued to grow across the country. Therefore, the story of the small whimper that transformed into a citywide celebration of courage and compassion would linger in the minds of everyone who heard it. Nobody could forget the moment Chuck emerged from the swirling smoke, cradling a half-conscious dog in his arms, proving that no flame could rival the heat of determination. That simple whimper changed everything, inspiring them all to become a little more vigilant, a little more caring. Chuck's story was told at dinner tables and around campfires, preserving the night's lessons for a new generation. Some said Chuck had wrestled the flames into submission through sheer force of will, but Chuck himself just smiled at such tall tales. He wanted people to remember that if they ever felt uncertain about whether to respond to a cry for help, they should answer it. Because somewhere in the darkness, someone might be praying for that exact intervention. Nobody forgot the hush that fell when Chuck declared that a living being was still inside. Nobody forgot the thunderous crash when part of the structure caved in. Nobody forgot the moment he emerged, coughing but victorious, saving a life that would have been lost in the smoke. And in that sense, Chuck Norris was more than a legend. He was a force that reminded everyone to trust their instincts and protect the vulnerable. His name would forever be linked to that miraculous rescue, sparking countless retellings that taught courage, empathy, and an unbreakable will to act, no matter the odds. The final lesson was clear. Sometimes your senses detect things no one else sees, but it's what you do with that knowledge that truly matters. When people asked what Chuck would do if he heard another small whimper in the midst of chaos, they already knew the answer. He would plunge into danger again, because leaving anyone behind was never an option. That conviction kept hearts beating stronger and communities looking out for one another. Chuck walked on, carrying the memory of the flames and the dog's frightened eyes, carrying the gratitude of a city that saw how one man's courage could make all the difference. He looked at Smokey and nodded as if to say, "We got this." The dog's tail wagged in enthusiastic agreement. The flames had challenged them, but compassion prevailed. And right when the story seemed finished, Chuck left everyone craving more. Because once you've seen how he answers a cry in the dark, you want to see what happens the next time the odds are stacked against him. If you want more jaw-dropping Chuck Norris stories packed with unstoppable heroics, stick around our channel for the next heart-pounding adventure.